Good evening, and welcome to the Center for Applied Theology. It is our pleasure to be celebrating the publication of one of our own's most recent monograph, and to this end, I hope you have brought with you a glass of wine. Indeed, we are here to mark the occasion of the publication of Dr. Patricia Rumsey's new book entitled Lest She Pollute the Sanctuary. And to start us off, I would ask Tom to offer a quick word first, and after he's finished, for Nick King to be on hand in order to properly introduce things. Thank you, Tom.
Welcome, everyone. I'm the editor-in-chief of Studia Traditionis Theologiae, which is the only series in the English language that is dedicated to the study of how theology evolves. Historical theology is the poor relation of Catholic theology and the poor relation of English-speaking theology. So every time a volume is published in the series, it marks not just a great achievement for the individual scholar concerned, and for this we offer, well, we're here to offer our congratulations to Patricia, but it also marks a little moment of evolution in our theological journey in the English-speaking world. German scholars have been doing historical theology since the early 19th century. French scholars have been doing it since the late 19th century. And as recently as only 30 years ago, a very eminent hierarch told me there was no such thing as historical theology, because while heresy had a history, theology was unchanging. That, I think, is not only an incorrect view, but a very dangerous view, because it relegates Christianity to a Platonism and also engages us in a great deal of academic tomfoolery, trying to pretend that X equals Y when we know plainly it doesn't. So this is not only an event for Patricia, but this is a little event for English-speaking theology. And now I'd like to hand back to James, and I'm looking forward to hearing Nick King.
And that's my only task now, and it is simply to call Nick King forward. So if you would unmute yourself, please, Nick. We'll look forward to your introduction.
Good evening, and thank you very much for this invitation, and a lot of old friends I see out there, though I couldn't join in the conversation earlier on. Well, look, let me strongly recommend this book to you. There it is. It's a timely, if undeniably challenging read. It's timely because, first, because we live in the age of Me Too, that worldwide movement against sexual harassment aimed at protecting young and vulnerable women. But it's also become evident that this movement has its place also in the Catholic Church. And it's timely because, secondly, the Church in England and Wales has recently been put to shame by the publication of the ICSA report on child sexual abuse in the Church. And these issues are related, at least in this sense, that they have to do with the notion that males exercise unaccountable power in the Church and in other institutions over women and children or vulnerable people, often with quite catastrophic results. Now, the argument of this book is that the origins of this marginalization of women goes all the way back to the way Mary is presented in the Protevangelium Iacobi. I'm going to call it PEJ, if you don't mind, for the rest of this book. It's a bit easier. Including, in particular, the idea of Mary's perpetual, including postpartum, virginity. And this comes with the interesting subtext that, in her view, apocryphal writings such as the PEJ have had a powerful effect on the liturgy and hence on popular theology. According to Sister, the PEJ presents Mary as a vapid, characterless puppet, and the underlying theology of the document is that of a pessimistic and negative worldview. Then in the second chapter, we get a very helpful consideration of what you might call introductory matters, with some interesting suggestions about the genre of PEJ, for example, satire or midrash or encomium, and there's something to be said for each of those. And the author points to the telling fact that PEJ proved so popular, perhaps as early as the 2nd century, despite the fact that the Church did not class it in its many versions as canonical, And talking about many versions, Bart Ehrman, in his introduction, I hope you all know this excellent book on apocryphal Gospels, Bart Ehrman points out quite correctly that it's hard to speak of an original version of the PEJ. And Sister Patricia performs a very important task in her attempts to disentangle the effects, which she regards as largely negative, on the lives of Christian women down through the ages. Now, one question that we may not evade is that of male misogyny in the Church, and whether this misogyny is the origin of the notion that celibacy and virginity are superior to the married vocation. In this context, there's the danger of men simply wanting Mary to be an example of women's virginity, submissiveness, compliance, and humility. I'm quoting her there on page 83. And so a religious woman is regarded as a child, incapable of independent thought and self-determination. Sister Patricia does well to point to the fourth gospel with its very different notion of sacred space. In that gospel, it's only Jesus, not a temple, nor a holy mountain, who can be so described. That's a sacred space. And she rightly warns against any kind of disembodied spirituality or any negative view of creation. And she quotes this trenchant line from Sister Pierre Buxton, whom many of us remember well, written some 30 years ago, interestingly enough. "The Church," said Sister Pierre, "will not be credible in our culture if it doesn't change its attitude to women, and this must mean in such visible, audible areas as vocabulary, ministry, liturgy, and authority." And there's a further point in this context from which we must not run away. It's the business of ritual purity and the influence on men of anxieties about menstruation. Here, the final chapter of the book is of some importance, dealing with the influence of the PEJ on the lives of women. As the author notes, there is nothing in the canonical gospel about either celibacy or virginity, with the possible exception of that strange logion at Matthew 19:10-12, which is about eunuchs. So I should very much like to commend you all to read this book and ponder on the issues that it raises. There are, however, one or two questions that are worth addressing, even though they don't undermine its basic thesis. One of these has to do with the fact that in New Testament scholarship these days, people are more open than they used to be to the possibility of the survival, at least into the 3rd century, of a very strong and lively oral as opposed to written tradition. So it may be that PEJ is not so much influencing church doctrine and liturgical practice as picking up something of the zeitgeist, something of what's going on among ordinary Christians, perhaps led by the Spirit. Sister Patricia's material on the Marian feasts and the way they've been affected by the PEJ may certainly be of significance here. So when she speaks of and I'm quoting here, the effect that the PEJ has had on liturgical worship and the consequent belief of Christians down the ages, I'm just wondering if it might not be simply the other way around, and that PEJ may be simply reflecting current Christian piety. I saw an example of this the other day in that well-known hymn by Jan Struther, Lord of All Hopefulness. In that hymn, Jesus is described in these terms, or addressed in these terms, whose strong hands were skilled at the plane and the lathe. Now, this is not clearly directly derived from the Gospels, where Jesus is described as a tectone, however you translate that, but it's a not unhealthy meditation of Christian piety on the hints that are offered in Scripture. And it seems likely to be the case that early monasticism was in part a rebellion against the developments under Constantine, when the church became established as not just a religio licita, but as the empire's official religion. And it's sometimes argued that religious life for women turned out to be an option for their freedom, who would then not have to be responsible for men for what they did or how they lived. Although, of course, Sister Patricia would point out that the men find it an irresistible temptation to seek to control them. It's her view that the spirit of PEJ is still alive and well and still influential on the lives of women in the 21st century, still insisting on an ideal based on an apocryphal text rather than that of the gospel. And similarly, the very helpful chapter 7 of this book on the iconographic tradition obviously points to one way of assessing the impact of the text. But here, of course, it may not be the direct influence of PEJ that we're observing. Some, you see, will wonder about the Mariology that's to be found in PEJ, which, as Sister Patricia points out, is a great deal higher than that in the Gospels. So the question might be, has that been imposed on the Church for a foreign source, or is it, as Pope Francis might argue, an instinct of the good, an instance of the good instincts of popular piety rather than a phenomenon imported from outside? You see, popular devotion often takes the incarnation very seriously indeed, and that shouldn't be lightly dismissed. So Sister Patricia mentions Bernard of Clairvaux in his effective approach to prayer and spirituality. Now, did he take his cue from the PEJ or from the prayerful instincts of ordinary people, opening up mystical experience to all Christians? It could be argued either way. So I'm going to end with just 5 questions. I was told to be 25 minutes. I see I'm going to be less than that. I hope you don't mind. On the whole, it's better to have a talk that's shorter rather than longer. Anyway, here are 5 questions, and I want you to notice that these questions do not in any sense undermine the thesis of the book, but I think they're worth considering. First, what is the origin of the exclusion of women from sacral roles in the Church? Secondly, is it at all relevant that at least some women have been attracted to the enclosed contemplative way of life and freely chosen it? Third, is it possible that the tradition that surfaces in the PEJ does not originate there but comes from a lively oral tradition of popular piety? Fourth, does the PEJ itself sufficiently account for the rich complexity of Marian devotion in the Church? And clearly, this many-sided devotion to Mary goes far beyond what you can find in the canonical Gospels. And 5th question, a rather pedantic point on my part, is it really the case that Mary is the mother of at least 7 children, which is said twice on pages 19 and 87, but the evidence isn't given? But may I commend you all to this book, to all of you, and wish the author in particular a very, very successful and happy time. I hope lots of people will buy it.
Nick, thank you very much. This is Tom O'Loughlin saying this, and now can we hear from the author herself?
Yeah, just getting my wine. Thank you. Well, thank you very, very much, Nick. I really appreciate all the points that you've made. It'd be really good to sit down and argue some of those questions out with you. But I'll leave that for the audience. And we can all take away those questions and think about them. I'd like to begin by thanking, as well as Nick, so many other people who have made this book possible. In fact, if it wasn't for these people, this book would never have come into existence at all. Tom, first of all, because it was articles of his that got me interested in the first place. And then friends like Hilary and Anya and my brother, all of whom are listening in. And if it hadn't been for their interest and their constant prodding and encouragement, I'd never have seen it through to the end. Plus my community, some of whom are here tonight, who have been very, very patient. And also I'd like to thank Bart, who has been the most patient editor imaginable, because there have been a lot of hiccups caused by the virus restrictions that produce complications along the way, and he has seen it through to the end very admirably. My involvement with the text, the Protevangelium Iacobi or PEJ or the Gospel of James, it's got so many different names, But my engagement with it goes back a very long way. When I was a postulant, that's a beginner nun with large L plates on, I remember buttonholing my long-suffering novice mistress, who's actually here with me tonight, buttonholing her and saying, is it an article of faith to believe that Mary was presented in the temple? Because I don't much like the idea. It's so long ago that I can't remember what my objection was, and also I can't remember what she said. But I suspect that my problem was something to do with it making Mary out to be different and so special, where the picture that I had of Mary from the very beginning was of somebody quite ordinary and just one of us. After that, I picked up the various stories as they're presented in this text. I remember the old sisters used to talk about them as if they were gospel, particularly the rather distasteful one about Salome. I didn't really know where they'd come from. But more recently, Tom has written a couple of articles about the Protevangelium and liturgy, and I found those very interesting. And that sparked my interest off again. And then I read the passage in Peter Brown's Body and Society, which I've used at the head of the book. The image of the childhood of Mary was derived from the earlier Protevangelium Iacobi. This 2nd century narrative already presented Mary as a human creature, totally enclosed in sacred space. It set the tone for all later descriptions of the consecrated woman. Dedicated to the temple at the age of 3, Mary grew up in total isolation from the profane world. And that really, it just went click. I thought, well, that's what's happened to enclosed nuns. I recently was asked to write a piece for the tablet, and in that I reminisced about some various incidents, particularly one where at the Episcopal visitation, we were told to put 6-foot fencing on top of an already 20-foot high wall, boundary wall, enclosure wall, because we could see about that much of our next door neighbour's bathroom window. It's taking the whole idea of monastic seclusion to the ridiculous. So I began to think very seriously about this text. I approached it as a liturgist, and I began to think, well, how is it that we're celebrating at least 4 liturgical feasts, and the only reason for their existence is this text, which was actually forbidden, or at least very much frowned upon by the church? And it's precisely these feasts, Mary's amazing parents, who are named in this text, and they're not named in the canonical Gospels. Her parents, her miraculous conception, her presentation in the temple, and her virginity in giving birth. All of those, that's what marks her out as different, hyper special, put up on a pedestal that is unattainable by flesh and blood women. Marina Warner, I've quoted her quite a lot, but one particular passage, she says, a dualistic distaste for the material world reinforces the ideal of virginity. And I think that is one of the big problems that this text has maybe not given birth to, but has encouraged by glorifying Mary's purity to an absolutely ridiculous degree. She was never allowed, her feet were never allowed to touch the ground. She wasn't allowed to eat ordinary food. She had to eat special food brought to her by angels in the temple. She lived in the Holy of Holies, which we all know she couldn't possibly have done. She was just made out to be completely other. And as Warner says, it's this dualistic distaste for the material world. Anything that was natural, human, bodily, physical was bad. It had to be spiritual, supernatural, disembodied to be good and holy. If you'll forgive the reminiscence, there was an old sister in our community when I was young, and she was describing her very strict Catholic upbringing. And she said, we were made to think that God made the top part of my body and the devil made the bottom part. I think she might have been slightly overstating the case, but she did have a point. I think I would be quite downhearted, I'd be quite disappointed if this book was seen simply as a feminist nun having a rant about women's ordination. Women's ordination is not the problem, but it's a symptom of a much deeper, much more radical theological issue. Did Christ redeem the whole human race, or only half of it? At the incarnation, God became man in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. He walked this earth, and everything in the universe was touched with divinity. Everything became holy, even our humanity, even women. And I think that is the big question that this book, this text puts before us, that I hope I've managed to convey, that the problem is not with women as such, but whether women are understood as having been fully redeemed by Christ to fully share in the whole mystery of the incarnation. Whether that was in my 16-year-old mind when I was a postulant, I'm not at all sure. But it could have been somewhere lurking in the background, even if I hadn't been able to articulate it very successfully. I think that's really all I've got to say, Tom. But just to thank everybody for zooming in tonight and being part of our celebration.
Well, thank you. And I contacted Anya just yesterday and said, would you say something? And she said, yes. So we're now going to hear from Anya. Anya, can you unmute and you're going to give us a reflection.
Right. Well, yeah, I would, if I'd replied to Tom's email straight away, I'd have said no, but I slept on it. And yeah, no, for me, it was kind of autobiographical reading the book. Patricia sent me a draft some time ago, an early draft of the book. I'd never heard of PEJ, and but I reading PEJ first before I read the draft. I realized, yeah, I had certainly imbibed all this and experienced it, especially growing up here in the 50s and 60s in Ireland. And it was a great revelation to realize where all of this had come from. And I never really felt comfortable with the huge devotion to Our Lady. And my dad had a huge devotion to Our Lady. And I remember asking him, a young teenager, and asking him, why does he pray to Our Lady? I said to him, I pray to the Sacred Heart, as though like, you know, I'm going right to the top. And his reply was, well, if you want a favor from a great king, the best person to go to is to ask his mother. And that kind of reflected, yeah, the spirituality and the genuine spirituality. But it to me, it was almost like a barrier. And anyway, I never felt comfortable with it. And then in my adult years, I spent a good number of years in an enclosed monastic community. And as the years went on, I felt a growing dis-ease with the teachings and exhortations that were coming from official church teaching or coming maybe from the Pope in encyclicals on Mary as the model for religious. And again, it was merely putting a model in front of us that was unattainable. And I suppose for me, it was because I had imbibed all this stuff of Mary from the PEJ, but I just wasn't aware of it. And then also on enclosure for nuns, I began to feel more diminished by all this teaching and exhortations than inspired. And it became my yardstick then. I came to a conclusion at one stage, whatever I hear about Mary, if this fits in with the Mary of the Gospels, I'm comfortable with that. But anything beyond that, I had to let go. And the same with the kind of the whole teaching around enclosure. I began to feel it was a way of control, and I felt uncomfortable with that. And as I read the book, I could kind of see myself at various stages of my life in different quotes that Patricia gave. Now, one of them was, it was a document that you quoted. Now, I gave the loan of the book, so I don't have the book, but it was a monastic community of women, and they were extolling the benefits of enclosure. And you quoted it quite lengthy. And I remember reading that and thinking, gosh, I used to really, there was a time I would have believed that and I would have gone along with that. And yet when I read it now, I kind of was shocked. So yeah, it was liberating for me to read the book and the research and the analysis. And it was also affirming for me. And just having come to some of those conclusions from life's experience without actually knowing where it was all coming from. So that's all I have to say.
I just want to be very brief as the editor of the series. I won't tell you how many texts come across my desk every year, but over the past 12 years, we have produced, or are in the process of producing, 48 volumes in the series. I think myself and Bart began the series sitting in a library about nearly 20 years ago now. And I think if we had realized then just how much work it is, we would have left the library and have just gone across the road to a very nice pub and have had a quiet drink. But of all the volumes, of all the proposals that come across my desk, they come across as full texts, which I dread seeing, and they come across as proposals, and they come across as odd chapters. The hardest part of my job as an editor is to say, I think you're onto something, but you really have only scratched the surface. So I then say, could you send me a chapter more or less as you think it'll be worked up? And the chapter arrives, 30 pages. You can see they've put great pleasure into this because they've put all the nice fonts on and all that, which don't really help because that just means breakpoles have to take them out. But then I look at the bottom of the page and I see 30 pages, 2 footnotes, one of which is merely a thank you to some librarian somewhere. That just simply will not do if we're engaged in a serious pursuit of the truth. Perhaps I shouldn't say this because it may put you off. This book is 231 pages long, and there are 901 footnotes. That, you can do the maths yourself. It means that there's never a page that there isn't about a quarter of the number of lines that are devoted to footnotes. And people say they're just boring. Well, we live in a world where for 4 years we had a buffoon in the United States who just said things and people were supposed to take them seriously. The idea that one verified facts and that one showed one's sources and carried one's cards openly was just laughed at. But this sort of, and one guy actually wrote back to me, said, I don't want to write a boring book. Well, it doesn't matter whether it's boring or not. The pursuit of the truth and finding the source of the problems in theology is as slow and methodical a process as finding the truth or the source of problems in medicine or in a virus. We do it slowly, we do it collaboratively, and we do it in an evidence-rich way. I know there are 901 footnotes in this because I sat down earlier today and I counted them. And so it's a tribute. This sort of writing. People say this is a hard read. It's not an easy read. It's not intended to be an easy read, but it's an even harder research job. And so I hope we will all appreciate when we raise our glasses in a few moments. 901 footnotes is a hell of a lot of work. The great Jean Mabillon, when he was setting up the basis for the history of theology in the middle of 17th century France, was asked by his abbot in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, but, brother, the Holy Rule says you must do manual labor and you are never seen in the garden. And Jean Mabillon replied, my Lord Abbot, I write footnotes. Now, 901 footnotes. If you can get 3 or 4 footnotes done in a day, you're doing well. So that's the sort of careful labor that theology needs if we are to be serious, that it's not just expressions of opinion, it's not just my hunch, but it's actually investigating the sources, carefully analyzing the evidence, and then presenting it in the same way a scientist presents it, with all the evidence laid out clearly at the foot of the page. Earlier, Nick referred to this book, and it's a fantastic book. Bart Ehrman is a very good friend of mine, and in fact, there you are. And it's that text that Patricia has used, and she's also relying on another very useful text by Ronald Hock. However, having praised both of these texts, now I'm going to advertise something. Keith Elliott of the University of Leeds is producing the first new edition of the Greek text from the manuscripts in nearly 100 years. And it's myself and Bart's hope that it will be published Greek on the one side, the complete apparatus, English on the other side later this year. And it's a very complicated text. Anya said she just read it, and I'm sure she would nod now. It's not an easy read. So George Gariby from Budapest is going to produce a commentary on it. So do read this book, but do keep your eyes open for later in the year when we'll have a new Greek text, a new translation, and a complete textual commentary on PEJ. And my hope is that by producing studies like Patricia's book and producing the basic tools of scholarship, the best critical edition that scholarship can produce in the early 21st century, we're actually opening up problems so that others, such as yourselves, can take up and run with. Okay. None of this would happen if it weren't for the great Belgian house of Brepols, who have been producing theology texts for several hundred years, and they're represented for us tonight by Bart Ehrmans. Dr. Bart Ehrmans hides in the background, and yet without him, modern Christian theology would be a lot poorer. Where are you, Bart? And will you say something to us?
Here I am. Good evening, all. Bart, another Bart, indeed. Bart Janssens is my name. And I am a publishing manager at Brepols, as Tom said. I'm doing Corpus Christianorum texts, so involved with a lot of footnotes and apparatus and small print. Well, in fact, Tom has just said most of what I wanted to tell you. First of all, I want to express my gratitude of being here among you with Patricia, with Tom, with all of you. We've come a long way, as Patricia said, but I think we are very pleased to have this in our hand and present it today. Brepols in Belgium is sometimes laughingly called a publisher of footnotes, but I'm very proud to be a publisher of footnotes. And actually, I wanted to make that point, but Tom has made it, and I see that in the chat as well. People make that point. It's very important. In a previous session, as you notice, I'm not a native speaker of English. In a previous session, I sort of described my role as a bookmaker, pun not intended at that moment, and so I was made aware of the different connotation of a bookmaker. But in fact, it's not a bad thing, I suppose, to be called a bookmaker in whatever sense the word may have. We keep on producing books. I was going to tell you about the forthcoming edition, new edition of the Greek text and accompanying English translation, but Tom has already covered that. This, by the way, will be published in another series Tom and I are doing together, so I'm very grateful for that collaboration as well. We did manage to go to the pub after our initial talk, but I'm still very happy, Tom, that we sat down in the library long enough to come up with all of these plans. This is volume 41, by the way, in the series. There's several more in the press or in preparation and still ongoing. So very, very happy about that. Of course, the bookmaker commercial point of view is also to be kept in mind. And James, I think, has sent an email to all of you earlier today with an order form attached. Someone has to drop the word no, but there is a discount code on that. So if you consider buying the book, use the discount code you find on the order form sent by James earlier. And well, read the book. I've read it with great interest. Keep an eye open for the other books that are coming. And well, thank you all very much for your attention and for I've been in this kind of sessions well quite often over the past few months, and I have to say your presence here, I mean the number and the quality of the discussion, the ongoing discussion in the chat, because I think there will be some questions to be answered after my short intervention, are really of the highest level I've seen so far. So thank you all very, very much for your attention, for being here, and Patricia and Tom in particular for your collaboration on this beautiful book. That's it for me.
Thanks, Bart. I don't know whether it's fair at this hour in the evening to actually try and tackle the questions. My own instinct is to say, these are really serious questions, and the very fact that we've actually opened up all these questions is, to my mind, the proof that Patricia has done her job well. I think perhaps it's better to just rejoice now that the book is over. I know that there's nothing as pleasing for an author than to finally see her book as a physical piece of paper. You can know that something is published, but until you actually feel it, that the tactile nature of the book is a joy all of its own. And then there's a certain relief. Whew. There's no, you can just feel the space emptying in your head, where for many years you've been keeping a whole part of your head focused on a job, and now suddenly there's room. You can think you're putting flowers there or something else or whatever. There's just space in your head. So let's, rather than press Patricia with some technical questions, why don't we just raise our glasses? Anya, will you propose a toast?
Okay, to Patricia, for your hard work, your scholarship, your courage, and sticking with it to the end. Thank you. A toast to Patricia.
Patricia.
Patricia. Someday soon, hopefully, we'll all be able to meet in the flesh, and we'll actually be able to clink our glasses properly.
Before that day comes, though, Tom, I'm going to jump in here and say I've thoroughly enjoyed the input that we've received from the different voices we've heard. I'm delighted that so many have turned up tonight, because I think a book like this deserves the coverage, but also encourages precisely the kind of conversation that we want to see continue. In that respect, I want to make a bit of a plug before we go, and that is to say that the Center for Applied Theology website is constantly evolving. And one of the things that's been added in the last couple of days, or last week or so, is a theological forum, which is open to members of the center. Now, that forum will only be as good as the contributions made on it. And I'm seeing a lot of questions and comments popping up in the chat portion of this Zoom meeting tonight. I would ask you, especially if you're already a member, to carry those questions with you and put them on the forum so that all of us can be involved in engaging with them. But if you are not a member, please do visit appliedtheology.org.uk and consider supporting the work of the center, because it's a result of what we are trying to do that a conference like this one, a book launch like this one, is possible. So if you're not already a supporter of the center, visit our website. Please consider supporting and get involved with the theological conversation.
James,